Welcome, one and all, to this latest edition of the Future So Right podcast. This is a Green Flame Press production, and I am your host, Pete Beal. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you as well to everyone who has tuned in to our first two episodes. Your support is greatly appreciated. So here we are. We're back with another edition about 2 weeks after our last edition. And we're back with an episode that I hope any aspiring writers will find entertaining and helpful. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how we craft realistic dialogue and tips for mostly aimed at beginners when it comes to this, but hopefully writers of any level can take something away from it, right? I find that there's one thing, well, there's a lot of things that newer writers struggle with, but one of the most common is dialogue. And a lot of times, and I know this was true for me, and I've had other writers tell me it was true for them, they go through their first draft after they write it for a first time. And there are certain areas that they feel are pretty strong, and there are certain areas where they feel they have a lot of growth that needs to occur. And I have very rarely heard anybody say after they've written their first draft of their first book, I love my dialogue. I think my dialogue is perfect this first time around. It just doesn't happen very often because it's something that I think takes a lot of practice. There's no secret formula to writing good dialogue, but I think there are some very basic tips that can help us cut a few bad habits that we might have. And so that's going to be our main topic of discussion for today. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. I think one thing that we all want from our dialogue is for it to be realistic. And I think sometimes this is a trap that a lot of writers fall into, where they take this perhaps a little bit too far. And what I mean by that is that when we talk to each other in person, if you and I are standing and having a conversation, there's a pretty good chance there's going to be what's known as small talk involved. And while adding these types of things to your creative writing project might project a certain sense of realism, so to speak, it's not going to do very much to engage your reader. And honestly, it's just going to seem like you're trying to fill a page. I'll give you an example. So let's say we have two characters named John and Jennifer. And John and Jennifer are going to have a conversation. And the start of their conversation is going to go a little something like this. Hello, Jennifer. How are you? Said John. I am good, John. How are you? Said Jennifer. I am doing good. This weather is very nice, isn't it? Said John. This is nice weather, said Jennifer. Okay, so I intentionally made that pretty bad, but I think I'm making a little bit of a point here. Do we need this in our book? We understand that this is going to happen in real life between two people when they greet each other, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean we want that in a creative writing project where we're trying to keep our readers engaged. How often do you see, for example, on a television show or a movie, two characters have a prolonged conversation about weather? Unless you're watching the movie Twister, in which case I retract my point. But other than that, there aren't very many occasions where that type of medium is going to spend a lot of time on senseless small talk. So realism, when we're talking about dialogue, it can be a great thing, but we do have to be careful to not get too carried away with it, right? Readers will oftentimes just want you to kind of get to the point of what these two characters are trying to say, right? Isn't that how you feel? If you're reading a book and you were to see the dialogue that I had just given as an example, how would you feel about that? You would probably feel like the author just wasted a few seconds of your life that you're not getting back talking about the weather. So I'd say that would be my first tip is yeah, you want your dialogue to feel real, but you don't want to do that at the expense of stalling your plot or looking like you're just trying to fill space on a page. So that would be tip number 1. Now, I think it kind of naturally leads in to tip number 2, just with the example that I gave earlier. And we're going to talk just a little bit about dialogue tags. And if you're not familiar with the term, a dialogue tag is basically that little bit at the end of a sequence of dialogue. For example, John said, Jennifer said. That is a dialogue tag. It helps the reader identify who is speaking. And I think that most writers are going to go one of two ways with this. They either overuse dialogue tags or they underuse dialogue tags. Very few people are going to get this perfect on their first time out. And I don't think you should expect yourself to get this perfect on your first time out. That being said, there are some pointers, I think, in terms of when and how to use dialogue tags that I think could be helpful. Let's take the example earlier where John and Jennifer are having a conversation. So we only have 2 characters involved in this scene. So what does this mean? It means we're probably not necessarily going to need to use a lot of dialogue tags once we've established how the flow of the conversation is moving. Right? So we know that John speaks first because we open that with the tag John said. And we know that Jennifer replies to him because we use the tag Jennifer said. So after that, do we really need to include a dialogue tag every time that we switch people? I would argue that we do not. Now, there could be certain instances where you're going to want a dialogue tag after pretty much every piece of dialogue. That might be, for example, if there are 12 different characters in a scene having a muddled conversation amongst themselves, then obviously you're going to need to help your reader a little bit to identify who is speaking. But if we just have 2 characters in sort of a back and forth exchange, it's not like John's going to ask a question of Jennifer and then John's going to answer the question, right? So in those cases, we really don't need them. In addition to knowing when dialogue tags are needed and when they aren't, another thing that people tend to do with dialogue tags is use them to embellish dialogue. And while this can be okay in extreme moderation, in my opinion, we should try to avoid this. So, for example, let's go back to our characters of John and Jennifer. And maybe now they're having an argument. And so here's how some dialogue might play out. "Just who do you think you are to talk to me like that?" John asked angrily. So we're not going to get into too much about adverbs here because that could really be an episode on its own. But did we really need to specify, based on the dialogue, that John was asking this angrily? I would argue that we did not, because the choice of words that we already used are telling us that John is angry. You have to have a certain amount of faith that your reader is going to understand what you're trying to tell them. If you try to spell everything out for them like that, they're not going to appreciate it, and it's going to pull them out of the story. I'm not going to name the book, but I'll give you an example similar to one that I saw that just kind of made me chuckle. So maybe Jennifer responds with, "Shut up, John. I'm so sick of you running your mouth all the time," Jennifer shouted loudly. Now, do we really need to specify that Jennifer is shouting loudly? Is this opposed to Jennifer shouting quietly? The act of shouting itself is loud, and I think the vast majority of people in the world who might pick up a book and read it are going to understand that shouting is loud, right? So saying she shouted this loudly, you're just throwing in that extra word that's completely unnecessary. While we're on that topic, I think you'll find that most editors and publishers would recommend that you refrain from using too many, shall we say, fancy dialogue tags. So, shouted could be one example. The vast majority of your dialogue tags should be either the word said or the word asked. Those two should make up probably 90 to 95 plus percent of your dialogue tags. Anything like Jennifer shouted, Jennifer inquired, Jennifer elaborated, I'm sure you've seen them all, are really almost always unnecessary and should be used in extreme moderation. You should let your dialogue speak for itself, right? So, back to the example of John saying something angrily. Don't tell the reader that John is saying this angrily. Let John show the reader that he's angry with his choice of words, maybe with his physical actions during this. Is John clenching his fists or grating his teeth? Is his skin flushing red? Things like this are a much better way to immerse your reader in the story rather than explaining, John is angry and this is what he said, right? I mean, which version would you rather read? So those are just a few notes on dialogue tags. And if you're not sure, going back to the point of if we need a dialogue tag or not, this is where a beta reader can really come in handy. If you have a scene where there's quite a bit of dialogue going on, hand it to somebody you trust to give you honest feedback. And even better, hand it to somebody that maybe isn't a huge reader. And ask them if they find this confusing or if they find it just right. Do they feel you're spelling things out a little bit too much? Get their thoughts on the scene, right? See how it flows for them. Because somebody who doesn't read a lot, you never know who's going to buy your book, right? For all you know, your book is going to be the first book that somebody's read since high school. Probably not, but you never know, right? So get the opinions from those type of people. If they can understand it, then somebody that reads frequently is going to understand it as well, right? You want to make your dialogue accessible to any level of reader, don't you? Now, another way that you can achieve this, and it's best to do this if you have a partner who's ready, willing, and able to help you out with this, try reading the dialogue out loud, particularly if you have a friend or two. For example, with our John and Jennifer example, you could say, I'll be John, you be Jennifer, and we'll just read the dialogue to each other for a few pages, and we'll see how it sounds in natural conversation. Now, obviously, you'll want to read it without the dialogue tags, as if you're each legitimately playing a character, and maybe even record this, and then you can listen back to it later and see how it flows. Now, another thing you can do with dialogue is use it to advance your plot and further your world building. And I'll give you an example of this. So we're going back to John and Jennifer again. So maybe Jennifer, in her conversation with John, says something along the lines of, you don't think they'll attack Chicago, do you? Okay, so what have we done here? We've established that there's some sort of outside threat, but the reader doesn't quite know what it is. But this might make them feel compelled to continue reading to discover what this threat is, right? We know that there's some sort of perhaps hostile force out there, and that they could or could not attack Chicago. Okay. Now, you need to have a certain delicateness. Is that even a word? Delicateness? It is now. I'm making it one. When you go about doing this. Because the last thing that you want to do with these types of scenes is turn it into an info dump, right? You don't want Jennifer to go up to John and say something like, "Do you think Chicago is going to be attacked by the army of marauding, rabid Belgian waffle makers who have been rampaging across the countryside for the past 57 years?" Now, that's a pretty ridiculous example, but it is a bit of an example of an info dump. We don't need to know right out of the gate that Chicago is potentially facing a threat from an army of marauding Belgian waffle makers who have been plundering the countryside for decades, right? These are things we can discover as the story goes along. And this isn't how normal people talk, right? If two people are having this conversation, we can assume that both of them have at least a rudimentary understanding of what they're talking about. So, for example, if you and I are both fans of American football, and I know you're a fan of the Chicago Bears, I might walk up to you and say, "Hey, how do you think the Bears are going to do next season?" I'm not going to walk up to you and say, "Oh, do you think the Bears are going to win the Super Bowl for the first time since 1985? And do you think they'll finally solve the quarterback controversy and problems that have plagued them for oh so many decades?" Spoiler alert, the answer to both of those is no. Sorry, Bears fans. I had to take that little shot there. I'm sorry. But you see what I mean? We have to assume that two people talking about a subject that both of them have some knowledge about, they're not going to stand there and rehash every little bit of history. That's going to come across really obvious, and it's going to come across as an info dump. So I have one last thing that I want to talk about in regards to dialogue before we wrap up this episode, and that's the fact that everybody has a unique way of speaking, a unique vocabulary, and this is something you need to keep in mind. When you go about your day-to-day life, the chances are you're not going to encounter two people who speak exactly the same, right? And it really shouldn't be this way for your book, too. If all of your characters use the exact same words, the exact same manner of speaking, how is the reader going to distinguish them, for example, in those scenes where we don't use dialogue tags? You're going to have to use dialogue tags all the time, and that's going to get repetitive. So make sure, especially on your second, third, fourth drafts, that each character has their own unique way of speaking. And so what are some ways you can implement this? Well, it comes with practice. But a few suggestions that I would make: maybe you have a character who likes to speak in a very formal and proper sort of old-fashioned way. Maybe you have another character who prefers to keep his sentences short and to the point. Maybe you have a character who uses a lot of swear words, if that's the type of book you're writing. Maybe you have certain characters that have very bad grammar, and that's just a characteristic of them. What other ways do people speak? Some people misuse certain words. What some authors will do, and I've never really done this myself, but it's something you can play around with if it's something that you find interesting, is adding accents to certain characters. I would be careful with this. It can come across the wrong way. I certainly wouldn't use it for a lot of characters. I'd be very selective if you're going to use that route. If you want to, for example, have one character appear very pretentious, you could have that character speak in a way that comes across as pretentious. Maybe they're constantly using words that are larger than necessary, things like that. I would say the most important thing you need to remember about dialogue is that it's one of the most powerful tools that you have at your disposal for developing your characters. And if you remember that and you treat it as such, you're going to do just fine. It's going to take practice and it's going to take time. You're not going to read your dialogue the first time and be happy with it. If you are, please let me know what you're doing because I would like to emulate you. But for most of us, it's going to be harder than that, and that's okay. That's normal, and just keep that in mind. You want your characters to be realistic, you want them to speak in a realistic way, and you want to use your dialogue as a way to give each character their own unique personality. Now, while we could sit here all day and talk about writing dialogue, I think this is a good place to wrap up. Hopefully the tips that I shared today can be at least somewhat helpful, especially to beginning writers. If you have any tips or tricks that you like to use for your dialogue, you can submit those to this podcast, and I would be more than happy to read them aloud in the next episode. You can do so at my website, petebeal.com. If you're watching this broadcast via YouTube, I will link this down in the description below. Otherwise, you're probably already on my website, and you can submit any comments, questions, or topic suggestions you have. I'm also always looking for guests for the podcast. We actually have a guest booked coming on in a few weeks, and if you would like to be the next guest, I would love to hear from you. So please make sure to let me know if you're interested in appearing. Otherwise, your support is greatly appreciated. I really appreciate everyone who has listened to these episodes thus far. If you're listening to this for the first time, welcome. Make sure to give me a thumbs up, a subscription. It really helps out. Otherwise, I will see you on the next edition of the Future So Right podcast. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay creative, and always keep writing. Thank you.